Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're really zeroing in on something many of us bump into, narcissism. We've got some really interesting text here that kind of breaks down the science, some, well, surprising short-term upsides, and then the more predictable long-term issues with narcissistic traits.
Right.
Our mission really is just to give you a clear, useful picture of what these traits actually look like.
Exactly. We're trying to cut through, the clinical jargon and just give you the core stuff from these sources, help you spot patterns, understand the impact without needing a psych degree.
Okay, perfect. Let's dive in then. So our sources point to some early warning signs if you're dealing with someone leaning narcissistic, especially, up close.
Yeah.
One thing that jumps out is this constant drama. It's like they need chaos almost.
Yeah.
Why is that, do you think?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that drama often puts them right at the center of things.
Oh, okay.
By stirring up conflict, they can then be the one managing it, or the victim of it, or just the focus, like a self-made spotlight almost.
Wow, that sounds exhausting.
Okay.
Okay, another big one mentioned is the difficulty or maybe outright refusal to genuinely apologize or take responsibility.
Yeah.
It's always someone else's fault, isn't it?
Always. It's a real defensiveness. It seems to stem from a deep difficulty in admitting any flaws.
Yeah.
So blaming others, exploiting things, it serves that need to protect a perhaps quite fragile self-image.
Right. That makes sense. It's also interesting how the sources mention these traits can actually start in childhood and just stick around.
Yeah, research does show a fair bit of consistency there. I mean, people change, of course, but early patterns, they can persist. They shape how adults interact.
So what kind of early patterns are we talking about?
Well, some theories point to things like perhaps inconsistent parenting, or maybe even getting lots of praise, but without genuine emotional connection. It's complex, obviously.
Okay, now the experts in our material actually break down narcissistic behaviors into three kinds of types. First up, perpetrator narcissists. These are the ones with that feeling of superiority, craving admiration, kind of the classic picture many of us have.
That's definitely a very visible type, the overt grandiosity. But it's important to see the whole range.
Because there's also the malignant narcissists.
Yeah.
And this sounds darker.
It is. Here, the behavior really crosses into harmful territory. Think abusive tendencies, a real lack of empathy, seeing everyone else as a rival or an obstacle.
Gosh, that sounds incredibly damaging to be around. And then the third type was vulnerable narcissists. This one surprised me a bit.
Yeah.
They're described as prone to shame, insecure, really sensitive to criticism. Almost the opposite of that first type. How does that fit?
It's a fascinating contrast, right? There's still that core self-importance, but it's often hidden under layers of insecurity and like a fear of judgment.
So that sensitivity.
That sensitivity can actually fuel defensiveness, maybe even manipulation, as a way to shield that fragile ego. It looks different, but the root might be similar.
Okay, wow. Now here's a real curveball from the sources. Apparently some narcissistic traits can actually lead to, well, short-term benefits.
Yeah, that often surprises people.
Like more popularity, better luck dating, even landing good jobs. How does that work? Wouldn't people see through it?
Well, initially, that strong projection of confidence, even if it's not, fully backed up, can be really appealing.
Okay.
In dating, maybe that intense initial focus feels like real passion. And at work, well, self-promotion can give you an edge, at least for a while.
At least for a while, seems key there. It sounds like those wins are probably temporary. The text really stresses that the conflicts these people create tend to catch up with them.
Absolutely, that makes total sense.
You can just picture relationships breaking down, trust eroding.
Exactly. That initial charm or confidence might open doors, but the underlying self-interest, the lack of empathy, the tendency towards conflict, it inevitably damages connections. It undermines long-term success, stability, everything, really.
Right. And there's maybe a tiny bit of good news. The research suggests narcissism can decrease a little with age, though the sources are careful to say this decrease might not be huge.
Yeah, it's often quite slight. Which raises a good point. Does that change really reduce the negative impact they have on others? Those core patterns can be pretty deeply set.
So if we kind of boil this all down,
Yeah.
This deep dive really highlights that constant drama, refusing to own up to things, blaming others, those are pretty big red flags.
Definitely.
And it's key to remember, narcissism isn't just one thing, right? It shows up differently.
Different types.
And while some traits might give a temporary advantage, the long-term fallout from all that conflict is usually pretty negative.
And what's really interesting, I think, is considering how some traits we often see as positive, like, say, strong confidence or ambition, might, in some cases, if taken to an extreme, actually stem from these narcissistic tendencies.
That's a really thought-provoking angle. So thinking about that, how might understanding these dynamics maybe change how you interpret behaviors you see, and perhaps even your own expectations in relationships or at work,
Yeah.
something to mull over. That's your food for thought as we wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for tuning in.